Very often, the frequency ranges most likely to be addressed with EQ are the highs and lows, treble and bass. Even novice engineers and mixers know that boosting the bass gives you more thump and treble more sheen. Hell, every hi-fi has bass and treble knobs, and the first thing a lot of people do is turn them both up to maximum. This has always been known as a smile curve, thanks to the way it looks on a frequency response graph, or one of those old multiple fixed band graphic EQs. But while a smile curve may initially impart a slight sense of greater punch and clarity, that typical 100 Hz and 10 kHz boost shouldn't just be applied as a matter of course. And it especially shouldn't be used as a solution to a mix that suffers from a lack of inner detail, where many background parts are being covered up by other elements of the arrangement, or getting buried in the overall wash. More experienced mixers know that most of the fundamental frequencies and harmonics that make up the frequency ranges of musical instruments and voices fall squarely in the mid-range, between around 150 or 200 Hz and a few kilohertz, 3 to 4K. With the exception of a few outliers, like bass and cymbals, when you want to shape the tonal balance of an instrument or voice, you'll need to address this all-important mid-range area where you can alter the harmonic and overtone balance and deal with the changes in balance that occur when instruments are combined from the effects of masking. I'll talk about that more in number 6. In fact, human hearing is more attuned to detail in the mid-range. It's an evolutionary development, since the mid-range is where the human voice falls, and this sensitivity enhances communication. But it also means that when you set out to apply EQ to the mids, you need to remember that our ears will be more sensitive to changes in that area. For acoustic instruments and voices, typically a few dB boost or cut, 1 or 2, 3, maybe 4, is usually more than enough to affect a noticeable change in tonality. With a few exceptions. Drums and amplified instruments will usually be more amenable to larger EQ variations, maybe as much as 10 to 12 dB even. Electronic sounds may also tend to accept greater boosts and cuts without sounding unnatural or overhyped, since there's no direct acoustic frame of reference to make that much EQ subconsciously sound wrong or overdone. You'll want to keep an eye on the bandwidth, the Q. Generally, for boosts with acoustic sounds, the somewhat broader Q might sound more natural and be less likely to make certain harmonics accidentally stick out later or in the mix when combined with other tracks. Narrower Q values can come in handy for more corrective EQ applications, like if you hear an annoying ring at a certain frequency in an instrument that needs to be tamed. You've probably heard the old trick for locating a problem frequency like that. Dial up a big boost with a narrow Q and slowly sweep the range. The problem frequency should jump out, then cut at that frequency to tame it. Now, there have been tomes written about which frequencies to dial up to have what specific effect on which specific instruments. Obviously, I'm not going to try to cover all of that here. After all, this is a course on things to avoid rather than a reference manual of suggestions on what to do in every case. I will display this chart, which shows a typical division of mid-range frequencies into several distinct ranges, along with the terminology and subjective description of the tonal character of each of these ranges. And here's a brief audio example or two of what audible effect mid-range EQ will have on different sounds in those various frequency ranges. I will mention one other thing, not really a don't, as in something you should always do or never do, but a suggestion that many engineers might agree with. When it comes to mid-range EQ, you can often get better results by applying a cut rather than a boost. Remember, since our ears are more sensitive to frequency alterations in the mids, a boost may call attention to a certain aspect of the sound, a particular resonance, or a ringing or scratchiness within the overall tone. But a cut in an adjacent frequency can have the effect of bringing out a certain range more subtly by reducing the prominence of the harmonics and overtones around it rather than by addressing it directly. This may depend a lot on how wide the bandwidth, the Q, is for the cut. For example, with a fairly broad Q, a mid-range cut at, say, around 1 kHz or so, might result in a similar response to the famous smile curve you'd get by boosting bass and treble, but preserving more of the upper bass and lower treble or upper mids for a more subtle enhancement with greater mid-range detail, the kind of detail that can help a track carve out its place in a busy mix. So tread lightly in the mid-range. I'll cover a few more suggestions that relate to that in numbers 5, 6, and 7.